So I'm going to focus my remarks on the war, and I'm going to talk about four different aspects of it. First of all, I'm going to talk about why this war started, what's behind it. Second, I'm going to talk a bit about the course of the war itself over the past nearly 3 months now. Third, I'm going to talk about what it means for Russian politics. And then fourth, I'm going to talk about the US stake in the war and US policy with respect to the war. So we're going back to February 24th, 2022, when Russia launched its military invasion against Ukraine. It's an episode that at least some people, if not many people, were surprised by and completely taken aback by even. It's been a long time since two of the largest countries in Europe, in fact, Russia and Ukraine are the first and second largest countries in Europe, have been directly in conflict with each other since the time of World War II. So why did Vladimir Putin start this war? And I guess that's the first point, that this is Vladimir Putin's war. It was his decision, and he decided it for a series of reasons. There are other actors in Russian politics who influence decisions like this, but really their influence is minimal on questions of war and peace. And I think we can't help but talk about Putin himself, his worldview, his psychology a bit, the way he sees the world and understands the world. So for those of us who've been studying him for quite a while, and I guess it's fair to say I've been studying him his entire time as Russian leader, which is now over 22 years, a lot of what he has been talking about over the last year, both in the lead up to the war and since the war started, does not sound new to us. First of all, he has long held the view that the sort of political, global political situation after the collapse of the Soviet Union was not fair to Russia, that Russia had been humiliated by the other leading powers, including especially the United States, but the West in general, that Russia was not getting the respect that it deserved from the world, and that what people sometimes refer to as the international order was not fair to Russia, that it was dominated by the US and its allies, and other countries were just left to take whatever the US and its allies gave them. So he has been talking about this for an extremely long time. If we think back to 2004. So this is at the end of his first 4-year term in office as Russian president. Some of you may remember an incident that got a lot of press at the time because it was a horrific event. It was the Beslan school hostage event. This happened on September 1st to 4th, 2004. School in southern Russia was taken, controlled by a group of terrorists from the North Caucasus region of Russia, which is in southern Russia, where the Republic of Chechnya and other Islamic republics are. And they took this school and over 1,000 people hostage because of the Russian war against Chechnya, which is a region inside Russia that had been trying to declare itself independent. And the siege ended after 3 days with this chaotic storming of the school, where they had taken the hostages. Over 300 people died, over half of them were children. It was a great tragedy and a traumatic event, sort of at the end of Putin's first term, beginning of his second term. But the reason I bring this up is because he went on television after the event had ended, and he didn't spend any of his time in his address to the public talking about Chechnya. He didn't even mention Chechnya. What he said was that there are people out there who are trying to tear off a juicy morsel of Russian territory, and that others are helping them. And he said these others are helping them because they don't like a strong nuclear Russia, and they want to weaken and damage Russia, and eventually help dismember it. So what he was implying there, he didn't say this specifically, but what he was implying there was that the US was willing to work with Islamic terrorists who attacked schools to try and weaken Russia. And this has been a common refrain of his, not that specific point, but in general, if a government, for example, falls in a country that borders on Russia, he often would blame it on the United States and say United States meddling or something caused these events. So he sees the world through a prism in which the United States is this, great power that's treating Russia unfairly. And when bad things happen in Russia or near Russia, it's not because of events in Russia or events in these neighboring countries like Ukraine, for example, or Georgia or other Russian neighbors. It's because, someone is coming in from outside and stirring up trouble. So this is a very deep-seated view of his, based on the notion that Russia deserves status as a great power. It always has been and should continue to be so. That the United States is out to get them, and that Russia is vulnerable and not being treated fairly and not being respected the way it should be. So if you've looked at anything he said over the past 3 months since the war started, he's sort of talking in the same kind of language. So my point here is that this is nothing specifically new in the way he talks about global politics, although obviously a more extreme manifestation of it with the invasion of Ukraine. So related to that, and talking about Ukraine in particular, he's also made clear for a very long time that he doesn't really think Ukraine deserves its status as an independent state. He kind of thinks it's an artificial country. He thinks it's not a real nation separate from Russia. He thinks that Ukrainians and Russians are one nation and they have this shared history together. And the only reason Ukraine even managed to become independent was because of some decisions that were made in the early 20th century by the first Soviet leader, Vladimir Lenin, to organize the Soviet Union as a federation, which would give Ukraine the right to secede when the Soviet Union collapsed. So, he's been talking for a long time about this. In 2008, at a meeting with US President George W. Bush, he said to him, George, look, Ukraine isn't even a real state. Most of it was given by us when the Soviet Union collapsed, and some of it, came from Poland or the Austro-Hungarian Empire after the end of World War I. So, in his mind, it's not natural for Ukraine to be seeking to ally itself with the West, wanting to join NATO, wanting to join the EU, being hostile to Russia and that sort of thing. So if Ukraine isn't, friendly to Russia, that's because someone has artificially dragged it away from the Russian sphere of influence. And it was important to him that Ukraine stay within, Russia's sphere of influence and sphere of control. So I've been talking a lot about Putin. So I think I should step back and just say a little bit about the political system and why it is that it matters so much what this one guy thinks. So obviously, Russia is an authoritarian system. It's what political scientists would call an electoral autocracy, which means they have elections, but those elections are not really free and fair. The playing field is tilted in the favor of the incumbents, in favor of the Kremlin. So it's not a legitimate democracy, but it does still have regular elections. It does still have a parliament. It does have multiple parties, although the only ones that are allowed into the parliament have to be in some sense loyal to the Kremlin. But it does have all these kinds of trappings of democracy, and at least formally speaking, Putin has been elected president 4 different times over the last 20 odd years. But although it looks in some ways like a democracy, and that's the electoral part, in reality it's an autocracy, and it's a specific type. So political scientists think of authoritarian or autocratic regimes as being composed of 4 different kinds, basically. First, there are monarchies, classic monarchies, like Saudi Arabia would be in that category, where there's a ruling family and power is passed on from one king to the next, in terms of dynastic succession. And so that's one way historically of organizing authoritarian politics. There aren't as many of them in the world as there used to be, obviously, but there's still some around. A second type is military dictatorship. So, a country like Egypt has that today. Other countries have that very common form of government in the Cold War in many parts of the world, where there's a ruling military group, a group of generals who kind of make policy. And one of them is often, the head, but it's the military as a whole that's kind of controlling the country that came to power after a military coup or something like that. So that's the second type. A third type is what political scientists call single party regimes. So the most famous of these would be the communist regimes, like the Soviet Union was, to a certain extent like China is today, although the current Chinese leader Xi Jinping is kind of making it more a system loyal to him rather than the party as a whole. But not just communist party regimes have been like this. Mexico, for example, from roughly the 30s to the 90s was ruled by, it was called the Institutionalized Revolutionary Party, that passed power from one president within that party to another. So that's another type. And then the fourth type is what we call personalist autocracies. And this is really when decision-making lies most in the hands of one person. So in comparison to the other three I just mentioned, there's not a monarchic ruling family, there's not a military group or junta, there's not a ruling party. It's really about one person and his loyal supporters. And in that type of political system, what we find is that the institutions are relatively weak because, excuse me, much depends on the decisions of one leader, that over time he tends to surround himself more and more with insider loyalists who may not be the most competent, but he's comfortable with, and they've demonstrated their loyalty to him. And that often means that over time, they have access to less and less good information to inform their decision making, because his loyalists tell him what he wants to hear rather than giving him a good and sort of honest and true account of what's happening out there in the world. So we often see in these personalist autocracies that they're prone to mistakes because they're relying more on loyalty than competence, and they're relying on misguided sources of information because everyone's trying to please the ruling guy. And so part of the reason Putin's worldview matters is because everyone in the system kind of caters to him in the way he sees the world and what he thinks, unlike some other types of autocracies that have more kind of institutional constraints, checks and balances even within an autocracy. You don't really have that in the type of system that Putin runs. So a few more words about Ukraine itself. I think the reason this war came about, and came about at the time that it did, was Putin for a long time has felt that it's really important to keep Ukraine in the Russian sphere of influence, as I mentioned earlier, but that was not happening. It was slipping further and further away, getting more friendly to the European Union, orienting itself towards the West, wanting to join NATO, and that sort of thing. And that's true. The important thing is, though, and Putin has never seemed to acknowledge this, it's his own fault. And why do I say that? Because in 2014, Russia annexed part of Ukraine, the peninsula of Crimea. You probably all remember when that happened 8 years ago, and then sponsored a separatist war in the south and eastern part of Ukraine, known as the Donbass, where there's also a lot of fighting right now. And he did that because there'd been a revolution in Kiev, the capital, and more pro-Western forces had come to power, and he was afraid that they might join NATO, they might throw the Russian Black Sea Fleet out of Crimea, where the Russian fleet was based, and because it had a leasing agreement with Ukraine. And he saw this revolution in Kiev not being a homegrown sort of bottom-up phenomenon, but one that was caused by the Americans. He thought it was an American-led coup, and he once compared it to, he said the CIA was basically experimenting in Kiev like experimenting on rats, not knowing what they were doing, right? So he made this somewhat emotional decision, in my view, to annex Crimea and then start this war. And what that meant for Ukrainian politics is it took the most pro-Russian voters out of Ukrainian politics, because Crimea was a majority Russian. Most everyone who lived there, their first language was Russian. Similar things were true, although not quite as extreme, in the southern and eastern parts of Ukraine. So what happened is he took about 3-4 million voters who tended to vote for pro-Russian political parties out of Ukrainian politics, which moved the center of gravity in Ukrainian politics towards a more pro-European, pro-Western stance, And the remaining people in Ukraine were, not surprisingly, I'm going to use a technical term here, really pissed off that part of their country had been annexed from them. And that made them less likely to vote for pro-Russian parties and more likely to vote for, pro-EU parties. So the problem that Russia had with Ukraine after 2014 was it was wanting to ally itself more with the West. And it was because of what Russia itself had done. But Putin saw what was happening. He realized that the Russian forces were not really able to make a comeback. And he convinced himself of this narrative that you've probably heard something about, that the reason this had happened was not because of his mistakes, but because the Americans were supporting neo-Nazis and that kind of thing, which is complete nonsense. But he had to blame it on someone else rather than on his own mistakes. So he was watching as Ukraine grew closer to the West, how various NATO militaries, including the United States, were helping train the Ukrainian military, providing defensive arms at that time, not offensive arms, but defensive arms. And he could see that the situation on the ground was not likely to change in Ukraine's favor. As his time in power was growing later, as he was getting older and thinking about his legacy, he thought he needed to act to do something about it. And I think that's why we came to a war in 2022. So one more point on this issue before moving on, why the war. You sometimes hear the claim made that the war was started by Putin because of NATO expansion, and I have talked about NATO in the US, but it's important to point out that a country bordering Russia has not joined NATO since 2004, which was 18 years ago. Since that time, all the new member countries in NATO had been countries in the Balkans, so well to the west and south of Russia, not countries that bordered Russia, not presenting a military threat to Russia. And the US actually took 80% of the troops it had in Europe during the Cold War out of Europe after the collapse of the Soviet Union. So there was no military threat from NATO to Russia, and certainly nothing that happened in the most recent series of years that would have caused him to be more worried about the NATO threat if he was sort of looking at things objectively. So it's just simply not the case. I'm happy to talk more about this if people have questions, but it's simply not the case that NATO expansion caused the war. In fact, what we're seeing is the war is causing NATO expansion. If you've been reading the newspaper this week, both Finland and Sweden have decided that they want to apply for membership in NATO. And Sweden had been a neutral country for the last 200 years, and Finland had been a neutral country for the last 70 years. So the fact that these countries had premised so much of their international image on being neutral now want to join NATO suggests what a mistake this war was from Putin's point of view, because he's created this self-fulfilling prophecy. By worrying about NATO expansion up to his borders, he actually is going to lengthen the NATO border with Russia by about 800 miles when Finland joins the alliance, probably later this year. Okay, moving on to talk about the war itself. So the war started obviously in late February. We've been going almost 3 months. And the initial Russian plan seems to have been to try and push from 3 different directions from the north. If you've got a map of Ukraine in your head, right, Russia's to the east of it, Belarus is to the north, to the south is the Black Sea, so that's where Crimea is. So they push forces up from the south, from the east, and from the north from Belarus. And clearly the goal at that point was to launch a quick strike on Kyiv, the capital, overthrow the Zelensky government, President Zelensky in Ukraine, and install a puppet government that was loyal to Russia. And they clearly thought they could do this quite quickly based on what they thought was going to be the lay of the land, which they thought many Ukrainians would welcome them. As the expression goes, welcomed as liberators, right? Which was not the case. They thought they had many loyal Russian agents working inside the Ukrainian government who would assist them. That didn't happen. And so the attempt to seize Kyiv quickly failed, although they did actually get troops into Kyiv in the first week of the war. It actually was kind of touch and go for Zelensky in that first week. And you may remember there was a discussion in that first week about evacuating him from the capital. and the U.S. offered to help get him out of the capital and move him either to the west of Ukraine or even overseas to Poland. And he responded by saying, I don't need ride, I need an ammunition. And he, decided he was going to stay in Kiev and rally the country for the defense. And that's what he did. So that initial attempt to seize Kiev failed. Then Russia tried more slowly to push a lot of troops in from the north and northeast to take it, not in sort of one big leap, but more slowly by overwhelming force. And what they found was that they had overextended their military lines by trying to attack from so many directions. They did not have good logistics in behind the existing forces. And a lot of the Russian troops initially involved in the war didn't even know why they were there or what they were doing. They thought they were on exercises in Belarus, and all of a sudden they find they're in a war. So the Ukrainians had better morale, they had the defensive advantage, and they were able to stop that slow motion Russian attack on Kiev. They did make some gains in the east, in the south, but they eventually were forced to withdraw those troops that had tried to seize the capital and focus them more on the war in the eastern part of the country. And that's kind of the phase of the war that we're in now, where Russia has been slowly putting troops into the eastern part of Ukraine, trying to seize the area that's known as the Donbass. It's two regions in particular, but also a couple of adjoining regions where they're trying to take over that territory. Because part of the justification for the war, besides this argument about neo-Nazis in Kiev and NATO threatening us and all that, was this argument that the people who lived in the Donbass region wanted to be close to Russia. They'd supported separatists there since 2014, and that this was an effort to rescue them. So now they have this more limited series of objectives, the Russians, in terms of taking control of these regions. And also, so if you think about a map of Ukraine, just north of the Black Sea, there's a smaller body of water called the Sea of Azov. The port city of Mariupol is on that body of water. Mariupol's been in the news a lot. City of about 500,000 people that has pretty much now fallen to the Russians. So you can see a line from the Russian border down along this Sea of Azov to Crimea in the Black Sea. And that's where Russia has made the most gains and is trying to push further now. So that's kind of where we are now in terms of the state of play. An important thing I would like to note is that just in the last 2 weeks or so, Russia has been pushed back from the second largest city in Ukraine, a city that's called Kharkiv in Ukrainian. In Russian, it's called Kharkov. But that city is over 1.5 million people, and it initially had been encircled by the Russians, but they never took complete control of the city. And now they've had to retreat from that area. Okay, so now the fighting is definitely moved to the east. And it looks to military analysts like it's going to be hard for Russia to really achieve its objectives that it set for that area as well, in terms of trying to encircle militarily the Ukrainian forces in that part of the country, because that's where the biggest part of the Ukrainian army was deployed, to the east, closer to the border with Russia. But those are experienced Ukrainian troops who've been fighting Russia for 8 years now, since they started the war in the eastern part of Ukraine. And they seem to be using their advantage of the defensive positions. They've gotten better artillery now from outside actors, including the United States. They've managed to not allow Russia to achieve control of the skies, what military analysts call air superiority. And so it's more kind of a stalemate there. And it looks like that's the way things will proceed in the coming months. I don't expect the war to end quickly unless there's really a complete collapse of the Russian forces, which I don't expect to happen, but is not out of the question. We do know, or at least we think we know, that Russia has lost an awful lot of troops, an awful lot of tanks and other armored vehicles. The troop estimates are kind of all over the place, but a number between 7,000 and 10,000 troops dead sounds plausible from what we know, which is a huge number, right? It's more than they lost when the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan for a decade. And this is just in a period of 3 months. And if they've had 7,000 to 10,000 dead, they probably have 3 times that many injured or captured or unavailable for deployment. So The British Ministry of Defense just said, I think it was earlier this morning or maybe yesterday, that Russia may have lost close to a third of the initial troops that it had for the invasion. So they don't have the resources that they had to sustain the initial attack. And I think they're probably going to run short of troops to be able to hold on to and occupy all the territory that they have managed to gain in the south and in the east. So what we're seeing happen in Russia now is what people are referring to as a partial mobilization. So you may have noticed in the news, if you've been following closely, last week when Russia celebrated the anniversary of the end of World War II, what they call the Great Patriotic War, there was talk in the media about whether Putin was going to use his speech at this military parade in Moscow to announce a full mobilization of the population. What this would mean would be that he would say, okay, this is no longer simply what he calls a special military operation. This is an out and out war, which means we're going to call up military reservists. We're going to allow ourselves to deploy conscripts to the war. Legally now, Russia cannot deploy conscripts in Ukraine. Only volunteer soldiers can be deployed there. So the idea was they would try and mobilize the entire country, for a massive war that would be sold as this massive war with the West to bring in more troops. He did not do that. And I think there are domestic political reasons that they worried that this would be a potential problem for them. But what they seem to be doing, as far as we can tell, is calling up small numbers of reservists, saying they're wanting to check on their status, make sure they have their contact information, their address, et cetera. And when they come in to report, they try and pressure them to sign a contract and offer them, reasonable sums of money to go off and fight. And so they're trying to, rather than call a general mobilization, to try and pressure people into signing short-term contracts to get them through this manpower shortage that they're facing. All right, so that's the second point on sort of how the war has gone so far. The third issue has to do with what this means for Russia internally. And in one word, we can say it's a disaster for Russia. I mean, I think politically, economically, socially, in terms of foreign policy, this was a massive mistake with massive negative long-term, or at least medium-term consequences for Russia. First of all, we've seen that the Russian military is not 10 feet tall, as many people thought it was going to be before the war. They have serious problems with troop organization, with the quality of their equipment, with basic issues like logistics and food supply and those kinds of things. So this notion that, Russia is one of the great powers because of its strong military has been proved to be at least partially empty. Obviously, they still have thousands of nuclear weapons. That's one of the things that makes them a superpower. Those aren't particularly useful in a war like Ukraine. And so they're relying on their Air Force, their Army, and to a certain extent, their Navy. And we're seeing that those forces are not really up to modern warfare in terms of being able to combine all different elements of the attack at once in a systematic way with very precise munitions, with good communication and intelligence and that sort of thing. They simply are not fighting at the level that, for example, we saw the United States at in Iraq 2 decades ago. And obviously a lot went wrong for the US in Iraq 2 decades ago, but that was after the initial sort of invasion of the country. It was not hard for the US to seize a country like Iraq. And Russia is finding its troops can't combine. It can't achieve air superiority the way they thought they could. So this is militarily a disaster. And also, it's worth noting that the military very much relies in their equipment purchases on equipment made in Russia, but often assembled with the help of Western parts, especially things like computer chips. You find that a lot of Russian munitions, a lot of Russian vehicles have Western parts in them, and those are now all under sanctions, and so are not going to be coming in to help them rebuild what they've lost in the war so far. Economically, also, this is a complete disaster. For Russia, half of the central bank assets that were outside the country have been seized by the US and its partners. The Russian government is predicting a decline in GDP this year of around 8 to 10%. Some people think it'll be close to 12%. So really the biggest drop in Russian economy really since the collapse of the Soviet Union. There seems to be entire sectors that are facing collapse, such as important sectors like auto manufacturing, train vehicle manufacturing, airplane manufacturing. All those things are things that they depended on their relationships with the West to sustain, and those things are starting to collapse. A lot of Western businesses have pulled out of Russia. It was just announced today that McDonald's is pulling out entirely of Russia and selling off all its stores and franchises there. And that may seem like a trivial thing, but it was a huge deal when under Mikhail Gorbachev at the end of the Soviet Union, they allowed McDonald's to come in. It showed they were opening up to the West, right? It created this image of a Russia that was opening up to the world. And now Putin has created an image of a Russia that's sort of being closed off from the outside world and sort of losing its international position, not attracting the kind of investment that they need to modernize their economy. And then finally, just in terms of foreign policy, I mean, there are important countries in the world, including the two largest in terms of population, China and India, that are kind of taking a middle road. They're not necessarily outright supporting the war, but they're also not outright opposing it. They're not adopting sanctions. They're continuing to buy oil and gas and things like that from Russia. So Russia's not completely isolated, but the degree to which the West and some of its partners like Japan, South Korea, Australia, Taiwan, Singapore, et cetera, which we can consider sort of part of the collective West, if we want to call it that, have imposed very firm sanctions on Russia that are going to hurt its ability to sell oil and gas, to sell military equipment, to rebuild those things, to fly and communicate internationally, all sorts of problems they're going to run into. And as I already talked about, countries like Sweden and Finland joining NATO is a strategic setback for Russia. So across the board, I would say this is a terrible, mistake in terms of Russian politics that's going to lead Russia to continue to be isolated, frankly, as long as Vladimir Putin is in charge in Russia. So this brings me to the issue of whether Vladimir Putin is in any sort of threat, from falling from power. And what I would say to this is that regimes like Russia's, these personalist autocracies that I talked about earlier, they face threats from two basic sources. One is from the elites, what we might call an insider coup, whether it's the military or other elite actors, politically or economically influential people. And they face potential threats from what we can think of as the streets or a popular revolution, right? So there are two threats, the elites, the streets. And I would say Putin, before February, had almost zero really serious threats from either of those groups of actors, and that the risk of either an insider coup or a popular revolution has gone up since February, but we're not really sure how much. And the problem is, it's hard to see any sort of mechanism for those who oppose the war to come together and try and organize an attempt to overthrow Putin or something like that. This type of regime has multiple different security, military, law enforcement bodies that kind of keep track of each other. Most of the people who head those are loyalists of Putin and have known him for a long time. So it's hard to imagine how any conspiracy would come together and try and get rid of him. I'm not saying it's impossible. And I think we do know that there are many people among the sort of political and economic elite in Russia who were surprised by the war, who see it as a mistake and would like it to end. But no one wants to stick their neck out and risk trying to organize something against Putin, because they would put at risk, their economic position, their political position, and even potentially their very lives. So I wouldn't expect a coup in the short term, although if things go really disastrous over the summer, I guess we would say we can't entirely rule it out. So what about a threat from a mass kind of uprising or that kind of thing? I also think That's not in the cards anytime soon. Russia has a very effective and repressive police state. They've been able to stamp out most of the open signs of protest. There were marches and stuff, but a lot of people have received fines or detentions for protesting the war. The restrictions on organizing are quite strict. There are really no organized political forces inside Russia that can organize a protest. You've probably heard of the Russian opposition leader, Alexei Navalny, who was the victim of an attempted assassination a couple of years ago and is now in a Russian prison. Not only is he in a Russian prison, but all of his organizers had to flee the country. So there's really no one there to organize a series of mass protests. Maybe over time, if economic conditions get bad enough, we could see more spontaneous protests breaking out, but at least at the moment, we don't see anything like that. So what that means, unfortunately, I think, is Vladimir Putin is in power for a while longer. He's likely to try and continue the war because he's not inclined to admit he made a mistake. He's likely to try and keep enough forces in the field to keep pushing forward if he can. I think their chance for a further successful offensive is low, but that doesn't mean they still can't continue to try and grind away and use sort of missiles and artillery and planes to still inflict a lot of damage on Ukrainian territories in the east and the south of Russia. All right, finally, I've been going a little over half an hour, but I want to say about 5 minutes about the United States and its stakes in the war. And then I'm happy to answer questions. So what I want to say about the US, I think the most important point I want to make is I've been relatively impressed by the job the current US government has done, the Biden administration, in terms of its approach to the war. And let me highlight a couple of things. This war, although it was in some sense shocking, did not come to a surprise to the world because the United States, from roughly November to February, systematically released information about Russia's plans for war. And whenever it looked like Russia was going to try and do something to claim the Ukrainians started the war or something like that, the US provided what intelligence it had, which means they had to declassify information and say, look, the Russians are talking about this. We know this isn't true. They shared it with our allies. They shared it with the media. And so what this did was it made it very clear to the world that this is Putin's war. It was a war of choice. He was not forced into it. Ukraine didn't cause the war. No one else was responsible but Putin for this. And what that did was it made it possible for the US to line up something I've already referred to, a series of very tough sanctions against Russia. So, seizing of assets, freezing of bank accounts, sanctions on banks that are doing business with Russia, unless they're through certain established procedures that are allowed to take place. All these companies pulling out of Russia. We've seen a very broad response of the Western world to the war, and sanctions much bigger, in fact, than Russia was prepared for. And that's leading to the economic damage I was talking about a while ago. So high marks for the provision of intelligence before the war, high marks for organizing a united front in terms of sanctions, at least with our major allies. Also high marks for the intelligence that the US military has been sharing with Ukraine, which is making it possible for them to do some of the attacks they've been using to defend their territory. And also, initially there was a lot of debates about what military provision the US should provide and other countries should provide. And most of the NATO member countries now have decided that it is legitimate to provide Ukraine with tanks, with air defense systems, with anti-tank weapons, with artillery, and intelligence, as I already mentioned. So Ukraine, despite being outnumbered militarily by Russia, and obviously, it's a smaller country, smaller economy, has been able to hold its own and has not run out of important military equipment so far. So this is allowing Ukraine to defend its territory, to defend its independence, and making it harder for Russia to carry out its objectives in the war. So I think those are the right positions to take. We can debate those or talk about those if you want, but I would say, decent work so far, because there's an important international principle at stake here, which has to do with the territorial integrity of sovereign states. So Ukraine's a member of the United Nations. Russia's signed multiple agreements that recognize Ukraine's independence within the borders it had when it became independent at the Soviet collapse in 1991, 1992. And it's an important principle of the United Nations Charter that, neighboring states can't just walk into a neighboring country with their military and seize some of its territory. And we haven't seen that in Europe since World War II, with the exception of the annexation of Crimea by Russia back in 2014. So there's an important principle at stake here that I think is worth the United States backing Ukraine in the way that it has. And in that sense, I've been supportive of US policy along with that of its allies. So I think that's probably plenty in terms of the core talk. I'm happy to answer questions that people have about the things I've talked about things I haven't talked about Ukrainian politics as well, if people are interested in that. So thank you.